December 1940. London is burning. German bombs rain down on the city every night. The Blitz has turned neighborhoods into rubble. Industrial cities like Coventry and Liverpool are being pounded into dust. On the map, the British Empire still looks vast, pink covering a quarter of the globe. But inside the underground war rooms beneath Whitehall, Winston Churchill knows a terrifying secret the public cannot hear. Britain isn't just running out of soldiers, it's running out of money. Completely, utterly broke. Churchill sits down to write one of the most important and humiliating letters of his life, addressed to Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States. Churchill is a master of language, but in this letter he must perform a delicate dance. He must tell the leader of the world's richest neutral nation that Great Britain, banker of the 19th century, workshop of the world, the empire that defeated Napoleon, is bankrupt. The letter describes the strategic situation, the U-boat threat, the desperate need for destroyers and aircraft, but the sting is in the conclusion. Churchill warns Roosevelt that the moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. Britain would fight on beaches and landing grounds, but they couldn't fight without ammunition, and they could no longer afford to buy it. It was a plea for survival, an admission of insolvency. This is the story of how the wealthiest empire in history reached the point of destitution, and how America transformed Britain's desperation into the transfer of global power. When war began in September 1939, Britain was still a financial titan. It held billions in gold reserves. British citizens owned railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, vast industrial concerns in the United States. The city of London was the hub of global insurance and shipping. But Hitler's war was different from any that came before. It was a war of machines. It consumed steel, oil, aluminum, and rubber at rates that defied all calculations. And critically, Britain had to import almost everything. The blockade of Europe meant Britain could no longer trade with neighbors. It had to look across the Atlantic to America for survival. At this stage, the United States was officially neutral. Congress had passed neutrality acts designed to keep America out of war. These acts contained a specific clause: cash and carry. The law stated that nations like Britain could buy American supplies, but they had to pay cash immediately and transport goods on their own ships. No loans, no credit. Gold on the barrel before crates left New York docks. For the first year of war, Britain drained its treasury to meet these demands. They liquidated gold reserves. In a secret operation called Operation Fish, the British government loaded the nation's entire gold wealth onto battleships and fast liners, shipping it across the dangerous Atlantic to vaults in Canada. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in history. Billions of dollars in gold bars and securities sent into exile to pay American bill collectors. By late 1940, the gold was gone. The liquid cash was gone. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington had contracts they couldn't sign because Treasury officials in London told them there are no dollars left. When Roosevelt received Churchill's letter, he understood the stakes. He knew if Britain fell, the United States would be next. But he faced a political problem. He couldn't simply give money to Britain. American laws forbade it, and the public would be outraged. He needed a way to help Britain that looked like hard-headed business, not charity. He needed to sell the war effort to American taxpayers. Roosevelt explained it with a folksy analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't haggle over the price of a garden hose. You lend him the hose and he gives it back when the fire's out. It sounded simple, generous, neighborly. But the reality of negotiations behind closed doors was entirely different. It wasn't a conversation between neighbors. It was a foreclosure proceeding between a bank and a bankrupt client. The man in charge of the American Treasury was Henry Morgenthau, Jr. He was anti-fascist and wanted to help defeat Hitler. But he was also guardian of the American taxpayer. Before the United States gave aid, Morgenthau believed Britain must prove it had stripped itself of every last asset. He demanded a full audit of the British Empire, every asset owned by the British government and every asset owned by private British citizens anywhere in the world. The value of every shell casing, every woolen sock, every share of stock. British negotiators led by Sir Frederick Phillips were stunned. They were being treated not as allies fighting a common enemy, but as a failed company in receivership. Phillips argued Britain had already sold off its gold. Selling long-term investments during war would be a fire sale, pennies on the dollar. Stripping Britain of overseas income would leave the country destitute after the war, unable to feed its population or rebuild. Morgenthau was unmoved. His instructions from Roosevelt were clear. The United States would not provide aid until Britain scraped the bottom of the barrel. The logic was brutal. If Britain still had assets in America, why should Iowa farmers subsidize British tanks? Why should American taxpayers pay if British lords still owned New Jersey factories? The most painful symbol of this forced liquidation was American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was the largest manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States. It was owned by British company Courtaulds. It was a jewel, highly profitable, generating millions annually in dividends flowing back to London, helping balance Britain's trade deficit. Morgenthau identified American Viscose as a target. He told British negotiators they had to sell it. The British resisted. They knew the company was worth over $100 million. To sell during war would be financial suicide. But Morgenthau held leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was working through Congress. Isolationists were attacking it, arguing Britain was rich and trying to trick America into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed a sacrificial lamb. He needed to show Congress that Britain was bleeding. He gave Britain an ultimatum. Sell American Viscose, or Lend-Lease, dies in committee. On March 15, 1941, under immense pressure from Washington, the British government seized American Viscose Corporation from its owners and was pressured by the US government to sell the company to 152 American investment firms in a deal led by Morgan, Stanley & Co. and Dillon, Reed & Co. Because the sale was distressed and everyone knew the British had to sell, the company only realized a fraction of its appraised value. The dollars from the sale went straight to the US Treasury to pay for rifles and aircraft engines. The sale of American Viscose was a turning point. British elites realized the true price of the special relationship. They weren't partners. They were a junior entity being stripped of assets to pay for survival. America was absorbing the wealth of the British Empire, not by conquest, but by contract. But it wasn't just industrial assets. Britain was desperate for destroyers. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers, World War I-era ships sitting in mothballs, obsolete, rusting, of little value to the modern US Navy. Roosevelt agreed, but there was a price. In exchange for 50 rusting ships, the United States demanded 99-year leases on British naval and air bases from Newfoundland to the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, and British Guiana. Think about that trade. Britain gave America a strategic footprint covering the entire Western Hemisphere, keys to the Caribbean and North Atlantic, military bases on British sovereign territory projecting American power for a century, all for 50 barely seaworthy ships. It was a geopolitical fire sale. Britain trading long-term strategic assets for short-term tactical survival. By the time the Lend-Lease Act was signed into law in March 1941, Britain had been stripped clean. The gold was gone. US investments were sold off. Bases were leased. The Treasury was empty. Lend-Lease was hailed publicly as the arsenal of democracy. It provided tanks, planes, oil, and food that kept Britain alive. Without it, the Nazis would likely have starved Britain into submission. But the financial terms laid groundwork for a post-war world where Britain would be debtor and America would be creditor. The aid was not a gift, it was a lease. There would be a reckoning. The Lend-Lease agreements with 30 countries provided for repayment not in terms of money or returned goods, but in joint action directed towards the creation of a liberalized international economic order in the post-war world. This meant Britain agreed to dismantle its imperial preference system after the war, the economic wall holding the empire together, a system of tariffs favoring trade between Britain and its colonies. It was the mechanism allowing British industry to survive against more efficient American competition. By signing, Britain was agreeing to tear down its own economic defenses, to open its empire to American exporters. They were signing the death warrant of their own trading bloc. British negotiators fought against it. They knew it meant the end of the empire as an economic unit. But German bombers were overhead. U-boats were in the Atlantic. The cash was gone. They signed. As 1941 turned to 1942, and America officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Britain and America fought side by side. But the financial disparity only grew. American industry, fueled by government spending, exploded. The US economy grew massively. Britain's economy was being cannibalized by war effort. Britain stopped exporting. It converted every factory to war production. It abandoned markets in Latin America and Asia. Who stepped into those markets? American companies. While British factories made Spitfires, American factories made Spitfires and refrigerators and radios and cars for the global market. America was fighting the war, while simultaneously stealing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, the transfer of wealth was absolute. World gold reserves had moved from London to Fort Knox. The financial center had shifted across the Atlantic. But the final humiliation was yet to come. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. It was pure joy. The tyranny of Axis powers had been crushed. But across the Atlantic in Washington, there was no sentimentality. Only a cold, bureaucratic machine that had been waiting for this moment. 7 days after victory celebrations, President Harry Truman signed the order to terminate Lend-Lease. The cutoff was brutal and immediate. All aid stopped. There was no transition period. In the middle of the Atlantic, American ships loaded with wheat and meat bound for Liverpool were ordered to turn around and sail back. The lifeline was severed. The British government was paralyzed by shock. They'd assumed aid would continue to help rebuild, that their economy, completely distorted to fight a common war, would be given time to adjust. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist, looked at the numbers and saw the abyss. Britain was importing half its food and almost all raw materials, paying with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain was bankrupt. Not in a year. Instantly. The country would have to default on payments, stop importing food. Rations would be cut to starvation levels. Industries would have no raw materials. Mass unemployment, social collapse. There was only one option. Britain had to beg. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship for Washington. He was sick, exhausted, suffering from a heart condition that would soon kill him. He believed he had a moral case. Britain had fought alone for 2 years, while America remained neutral. Britain sacrificed its entire economy to save Western civilization. Therefore, America should give Britain a gift, a grant, $6 billion, not a loan, retroactive payment for blood and treasure. Britain spent holding the line. He called it justice. But when he arrived in Washington, he found justice was not currency Americans recognized. The war was over. The American public was tired of paying for Europe. Politicians were suspicious of Britain's new Labour government, elected on a platform of socialism and nationalizing industries. They didn't want American capitalist tax, dollars funding British socialist experiments. American negotiators were hard-faced. They told Keynes bluntly, there would be no gift, there would be no grant. There would only be a loan on commercial terms with interest. Keynes was devastated. He argued, pleaded, warned that crushing Britain financially would destroy a vital ally against the rising Soviet threat. But Americans held all cards. They knew Britain had nowhere else to go. They offered a loan of $375 billion, barely enough to survive, with strings attached designed to strangle the last remnants of the British Empire's economic independence. The most poisonous condition, sterling convertibility. Americans demanded that within 1 year, Britain must make the pound sterling fully convertible. Anyone holding British pounds could exchange them for US dollars. Americans framed this as free trade, but it was a way to break the sterling area. During war, Britain had forced colonies and trading partners to accept payments in pounds, but forbidden them from exchanging pounds for dollars. This forced countries like India, Australia, and Egypt to buy British goods because their money was only good in Britain. Americans wanted to smash that loop. They knew if the pound became convertible, everyone would immediately sell pounds to buy dollars, because everyone wanted American goods, not British ones. Keynes knew this was a death trap. The moment convertibility was introduced, there would be a run on the pound, draining the loan in weeks. But the alternative was starvation. Reluctantly, bitterly, British Parliament voted to accept. They described it as a financial Munich, appeasing Americans to survive. The loan agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes died just months later, his heart giving out under the stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in living memory. Blizzards buried Britain. Coal froze. Power stations shut down. Factories closed. People shivered in unheated homes, lighting candles because there was no electricity. Bread, which had never been rationed even during the darkest days of the U-boat blockade, was rationed in peacetime. The age of austerity had begun. Then the clock struck on the American condition. On July 15, 1947, per terms of the loan, Britain made the pound sterling fully convertible. The result was exactly what Keynes predicted: a financial massacre. The moment the window opened, the world rushed to sell pounds. Countries that had been stockpiling sterling for years unloaded it to get precious US dollars. Money from the American loan, supposed to last years, began to evaporate. After just 5 weeks, on August 20, 1947, the British government was forced to suspend convertibility. They'd burned through a huge portion of the loan for nothing. The humiliation was total. The British Empire had tried to play by American rules and been crushed. This financial weakness had immediate geopolitical consequences. In February 1947, the British government sent a secret telegram to the US State Department. For a century, Britain had been guardian of Greece and Turkey, keeping Russians out of the Mediterranean. But now, with the Treasury empty, Britain could no longer afford it. The telegram essentially said, "We're broke, we're leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you have to do it." This telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine. The United States stepped in to fill the vacuum. It was formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower capable of shaping global events. The economic misery dragged on. In 1949, with the economy still stagnant, the government was forced to devalue the pound. Before the war, the pound was worth 4.86. In 1949, it was slashed to 2.80. Overnight, British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. But the final bill wasn't just paid in the 1940s. It was a mortgage spanning generations. The Anglo-American loan of 1946, money borrowed to keep Britain from starving after victory, was not a gift. It was commercial debt with interest. Every year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the US Treasury. Through the boom of the 50s, the gloom of the 70s, the Thatcher years and the Blair years, payments continued. The final payment was made on December 29th, 2006. Think about that. 60 years after the guns fell silent, British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived World War II. The story of the price of victory debunks the idea that wars have winners. In the modern era, total war is a negative-sum game. Germany lost and was destroyed, but Britain won and was bankrupted. The only true winner was the United States. The US economy doubled during the war. Its industry was untouched by bombs. It held 2/3 of the world's gold, and through Lend-Lease and post-war loans, it successfully dismantled trading preferences of the British Empire, opening global markets for American goods. America didn't conquer the British Empire with armies. It bought it, acquired assets, bases, and geopolitical influence in a distressed asset sale managed by the US Treasury. For the British people, the legacy remained a scar on national psyche. It created a lingering sense of decline, a feeling that the best days were past. It fueled the special relationship, which was always a polite euphemism for dependency. When Churchill wrote that letter to Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved his country from Hitler, but he also signed the deed of sale. He traded the empire for survival. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no choice. But the cost was the future. Britain emerged as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy. It had spent its inheritance to buy freedom for Europe. It was a noble sacrifice, perhaps the noblest in history. But in the cold, hard light of economics, it was a liquidation. The empire didn't fall. It was sold off piece by piece to pay the bill for doing the right thing. If understanding how empires actually rise and fall interests you, hit that subscribe button. The real lessons of history aren't in the victories. They're in the price tags. Thanks for watching.